You can see it in the grainy photograph from April 26, 1944. Two Nakajima Ki-43 fighters closing on something they'd never encountered before. The Japanese pilots reported a bomber, impossibly large, flying at an altitude where their engines gasped for air, carrying more ordnance than their entire squadron combined. When they finally damaged it enough to force it down near the China-India border, ground crews measuring the wreckage couldn't believe the numbers. 20,000 pounds of bombs in a single aircraft. That was the payload of their entire heavy bomber wing, condensed into one American machine they didn't yet have a name for. Meeting the reality Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda stood in the intelligence briefing room at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, studying reconnaissance photographs that made no sense. It was September 1944, and the images from Iwo Jima showed construction on Saipan and Tinian that could only mean one thing. The Americans were preparing bases for aircraft larger than anything the Japanese had encountered. Genda was 40 years old, one of the minds behind Pearl Harbor, a pilot who understood what air power could accomplish. He'd flown Zeros in combat, survived the crucible of Midway, and now served as an operations planner. He knew aircraft specifications the way a pianist knows keys, and these photographs troubled him deeply. The runway extensions are 3 times what they built for B-17s, he told the assembled officers, his voice measured. The hard stands are spaced for aircraft with wingspans exceeding 40 meters. Around the table sat men whose experience spanned 2 decades of military aviation. Colonel Takeo Shibata from the Army Air Service, who'd flown reconnaissance over China since 1937. Commander Yasunobu Maeda, a naval aviator who'd lost his carrier at Midway. Captain Hiroshi Ikeda, an intelligence officer fluent in English who'd spent 3 years analyzing Allied aircraft capabilities before the war. Ikeda carried a leather folder containing reports from agents in China. "We have confirmation," he said. "The Americans call it the B-29 Superfortress. Initial encounters occurred near Chengdu last month." The world they inhabited. The war was going badly. Everyone in that room knew it, though speaking such thoughts openly could be dangerous. The Marianas had fallen in June. The Philippine Sea battle had gutted their carrier air groups. American submarines were strangling the shipping lanes. Japan's bombers, the Mitsubishi Ki-21s and Ki-49s, the Navy's G-4M Betty, had been adequate for China, even impressive in the early days of the Pacific War. The Ki-21 carried 1,750 pounds of bombs. The newer Ki-49 managed 2,200 pounds on a good day, though that came at the cost of speed and left the aircraft lumbering, vulnerable. Their heavy bomber, the G-8N Renzan, existed only as 4 prototypes, and even that carried just 8,800 pounds. Impressive by their standards, but still not operational. Shibata had flown Ki-21s over China. He remembered the weight of 750 kilograms of bombs dragging on the aircraft, how you nurse the engines on long missions, how every extra pound of ordnance meant less fuel, less range, impossible choices. "What do we know about its capacity?" Genda asked. Ikeda opened his folder. His hands were steady, but there was something in his expression, the look of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to believe. "Reports from our pilots who engaged it indicate the aircraft is approximately 30 meters in length. Wingspan approximately 43 meters. It operates at altitudes exceeding 9,000 meters." The room was silent. Those numbers described something beyond their experience. "And the payload?" Genda's voice remained calm. Ikeda glanced at his notes as if checking them one more time. "Initial intelligence from Chinese sources and our own analysis suggest a bomb load capacity of," he paused, 9,000 kilograms. The buildup. 9, 20,000 kilograms, 20,000 pounds. The number hung in the air like smoke. Genda did the mathematics instantly. That was the combined payload of 10 Ki-21s, 10 bombers, in a single aircraft. "That can't be correct," Shibata said. "An aircraft that size, carrying that weight, at that altitude, the power requirements alone." "The Americans have developed new engines," Akita continued. "Wright R-3350 radials, 18 cylinders. Reports indicate 2,200 horsepower each. The B-29 carries 4 of them." Maeda, the naval aviator, leaned forward. He'd studied at Kasumigara, knew aircraft design. "At those weights, at those altitudes, the fuel consumption would be—" "It has a range of 5,000 kilometers," Akita said quietly, "fully loaded." The implications crystallized. From the Marianas to Tokyo was 2,400 kilometers. Round trip, the B-29s would have fuel to spare. They could carry maximum bomb loads and still have enough fuel for the return journey. Genda thought about Japan's cities. Wood and paper construction, narrow streets, centuries-old temples pressed against modern factories. He thought about the fire raids in China, what incendiaries could do. He thought about American industrial capacity, how many B-29s they might build. "When do we expect them to begin operations?" he asked. "Intelligence estimates late October, early November," Akita said. "Based on construction progress, they could have the first wing operational within 6 weeks." 6 weeks. Genda looked around the table at faces that reflected his own thoughts. They had 6 weeks to prepare defenses against an aircraft that could fly higher, faster, farther, and carry more bombs than anything in their arsenal. "We need to see one," Genda said. "We need wreckage, performance data, anything that will tell us how to stop it." At 06:30 on November 24, 1944, everything changed. The air raid sirens in Tokyo screamed for the first time since Doolittle's raid more than 2 years ago. This time, the Americans weren't coming back. The first radar contact comes at 05:30, more than 200 kilometers south of Tokyo. The signal is wrong, too strong, too solid. Junior radar operators double-check their equipment, thinking it must be a malfunction. At the General Defense Command headquarters, the duty officer takes the report and feels his stomach tighten. He's been expecting this since the reconnaissance overflights began 3 weeks ago. Those lone F-13s, the photographic variants, flying at 32,000 feet where nothing could touch them. "How many contacts?" he asks. "Initial count shows, sir, it appears to be over 100 aircraft." 100. The duty officer lifts the phone to wake General Seizo Arasue, Chief of Intelligence. The general is already awake, already dressed. He's been sleeping in his office since the Marianas fell. Across the Kanto Plain, fighter squadrons scramble. At Kashiwa Airfield, Captain Isamu Kashiide runs across the tarmac toward his Ki-84 Frank, pulling on his flight jacket. 26 years old, veteran of 50 missions over China, he's never fought over Tokyo. Never needed to. The ground crew has already warmed the Nakajima Homar engine, all 2,000 horsepower straining against the wheel chocks. "How many?" he shouts to his crew chief. "Americans, big ones, many." Kashiide straps in, runs through the startup checklist at triple speed. Around him, 11 other fighters are doing the same frantic dance. They have perhaps 20 minutes before the Americans arrive, maybe less. At 20,000 feet, the Ki-84s level off, engines screaming. This is the aircraft's ceiling. Any higher and the engine loses too much power. Kashiide's wingman, Lieutenant Takeo Tanamizu, fresh from training with only 10 combat hours, stays tucked in tight. The kid's good, follows orders, but today will be different from shooting down B-24s at 15,000 feet. "Bandits, 12 o'clock, 10,000 meters. The radio crackles. Kashiide squints into the morning sun. For a moment, he sees nothing. Then, there. But it's not possible. The formations are too high, at least 3,000 meters above them. And the aircraft themselves, my God, someone breathes over the radio. Look at the size of them. They're enormous. Kashiide has encountered B-17s and B-24s. He knows what a four-engine bomber looks like. These are something else entirely. The wingspan seems to stretch forever. The fuselage gleams silver, unpainted, reflecting the early sun. There must be 80 of them, maybe more, in perfect box formations. He pushes his throttle forward, coaxing every bit of power from his engine. The Ki-84 climbs slowly, agonizingly. The altimeter needle crawls past 7,500 meters, 8,000. The engine coughs, starved for oxygen at this altitude. His airspeed bleeds away. The Americans maintain 9,000 meters effortlessly. Kashiide can see their contrails now, 4 from each bomber, clean white lines painted across the pale blue sky. "Attack!" he orders, and 12 fighters claw for altitude they can't quite reach. At 8,500 meters, Kashide's engine is producing perhaps 60% power. His controls feel mushy, the air too thin for proper authority. He aims for the nearest bomber, a giant with a tail number he can't quite read, and presses the firing button. The Ho-5 20mm cannons hammer. Tracers arc upward, falling short. The range is too great, the angle too steep. He's shooting at aircraft 500 meters above him, and gravity pulls his rounds down before they can reach. Then the American bombers return fire. Kashiide has never seen defensive fire like this. From the B-17s and B-24s, you could identify individual gun positions, calculate blind spots. This is different. Turrets rotate with mechanical precision. The 50 caliber streams converge from multiple angles. Someone has computed the ballistics, the lead times, the trajectories. It's not spray and pray, it's mathematics made lethal. A Ki-84 explodes to his left. Sergeant Kimura's aircraft, one moment intact, the next moment a flower of orange flame and spinning debris. Kashiide doesn't see a parachute. He makes another pass, gets close enough to see details. The bomber's skin is flush riveted, streamlined, no gaps, no drag-inducing seams. The gun turrets track him smoothly, remotely controlled, he realizes. The gunners aren't sitting in the turrets. They're somewhere else, probably pressurized crew positions. His ammunition counter shows empty. 15 minutes of combat, and he hasn't touched a single bomber. None of them have. The radio is chaos. Pilots calling targets, calling hits that aren't hits, calling for help. Break right, break right. Tanamizu's voice, panicked. Kashiide rolls, but it's too late. Rounds hammer his starboard wing, punching through the thin aluminum like paper. The Ki-84 shudders, rolls inverted. He fights the controls, recovers, but smoke trails from his wing root. Oil pressure dropping. Below, Tokyo is erupting. The Americans have begun their bombing run. From this altitude, Kashiide can see the bomb bay doors opening on dozens of aircraft simultaneously. Then the bombs fall. Not a random scatter, but a carefully calculated stream, falling in neat salvos. The Musashino engine factory, part of Nakajima aircraft. That's the target. Kashiide knows it well, worked there briefly before the war. From up here, it looks like a model, neat rectangular buildings surrounded by worker housing. The first bombs hit. Even from 8,000 meters, he can see the explosions, dirty brown flowers blooming across the factory complex. Then more and more. The bombs keep falling. How many bombs does each aircraft carry? How long is this going to continue? His engine coughs, loses power. The oil pressure gauge reads 0. Time to go home, if he can make it. As he turns away, nursing his dying fighter toward Kashiwa, He counts the contrails overhead. 83 bombers. Maybe half hit the actual target, maybe less. Weather, the jet stream they've heard about, technical problems. The Americans had their own troubles. But that's not what matters. What matters is they came. They flew from the Marianas, 2,400 kilometers, bombed Tokyo, and now they're flying home. And tomorrow they can do it again. And the day after that. On the ground at General Defense Command, Arasue stares at reports flooding in. The Americans lost one bomber. One. A damaged fighter rammed it over the target. Kamikaze tactics, though they don't call it that yet. That pilot, whoever he was, is the only victory they can claim. Get me casualty reports, Arasue orders. Get me damage assessments, and get me every piece of data on those bombers. Around him, staff officers work phones, compile numbers, try to make sense of what just happened. The air raid is over. The all-clear sounds at 10:30, 3 hours from first radar contact to silence. Akita enters, carrying a folder. "Sir, we have initial reports from fighter pilots." And they couldn't reach the bomber's altitude. The Ki-84s topped out at 8,500 meters. The Americans operated at 9,000 plus. Our fighters could barely climb high enough to shoot at them. Arasue closes his eyes briefly. The bomb damage? Preliminary reports suggest limited. Most bombs fell outside the primary target area. But sir, that's not— "I know," Arasue interrupts. "That's not the point. The point is they'll learn. The point is they'll come back. The point is Japan has no defense against aircraft that can fly higher, faster, and farther than anything the Empire possesses." That night, at a restaurant in Akasaka that somehow still has sake, Genda meets with Kashiide. The captain's arm is bandaged. He bailed out when his fighter's engine finally quit, but he's alive. "What was it like?" Genda asks. Kashiide drinks his sake in one swallow. "Like fighting clouds. We couldn't touch them. And their defensive fire?" He shakes his head. "Everything we know about attacking bombers, everything we've learned, it doesn't apply. They can see us coming, compute the firing solution, and start shooting before we're even in range. The size? You can't understand until you see them," Kashiide says. "Each one looked like it could carry more bombs than our entire squadron, and they just kept coming, formation after formation, all at the same altitude, all untouchable." Genda pours more sake. On the table between them sits a folder containing preliminary intelligence estimates. 9,000 kilograms per aircraft. 83 aircraft reached Tokyo. That's 747,000 kilograms of bombs in a single raid. It would take 450 Ka-21s to deliver that payload, 450 bombers. "Can we stop them?" Kashiide asks. Genda thinks about the numbers, about American industrial capacity, about how many B-29s they can build in a month, in a year. He thinks about Japan's cities, their wooden construction, their vulnerability to fire. He thinks about what will happen when the Americans figure out that precision bombing doesn't matter if you're trying to burn cities. "No," he says quietly, "I don't think we can." By late afternoon on November 24, the damage assessment teams have picked through the rubble at Musashino. The numbers are disappointing for the Americans but revealing for the Japanese. Only 24 bombs hit anywhere near the primary target. The Nakajima engine factory sustained minor damage. A few buildings destroyed, some production equipment damaged, but nothing that will stop manufacturing for more than a few weeks. The Americans will claim a successful mission. They're lying to themselves, and they probably know it. But Lieutenant Colonel Shigeo Kawahara, leading the damage assessment, isn't focused on what the bombs hit. He's focused on what they reveal. Each crater is approximately 6 meters in diameter, he tells Arishu on the phone. These aren't the 500-pound bombs we've seen from B-24s. These are 1,000-pounders, maybe bigger, high explosive, not incendiaries. How many craters total? We're still counting, but preliminary estimates suggest over 200 within the factory grounds and surrounding area. Perhaps 300 if we include those that fell wide. Arasua does the mathematics. 300 bombs. From how many aircraft? 83 bombed, but not all of them hit the target area. Call it 50 aircraft that dropped anywhere near Musashino. That's 6 bombs per aircraft. 6,000-pound bombs, 3 tons. And the Americans will tell them later, through intelligence channels and captured documents, that the B-29 could carry much more, up to 10 tons in a maximum configuration. The real casualties aren't at the factory. They're in the surrounding neighborhoods where bombs fell short or wide. Working-class districts, narrow streets, wooden houses packed together. The fire brigade counted 63 dead, 118 injured. Families who woke up that morning with no idea they were about to become collateral damage. At Kashiwa Airfield, the fighter squadron is being debriefed. 12 Ka-84s took off. 8 returned. 1 pilot dead for certain, Kimura, the one Kashiide saw explode. 2 missing, probably dead, their fighters seen going down in flames. 1 pilot wounded, Kashiide himself, arm lacerated by shrapnel when rounds tore through his cockpit. The squadron intelligence officer, a young lieutenant named Sato who's never been in combat, asks the standard questions. How many enemy aircraft? What altitude? What was the defensive fire like? Brutal, says Captain Yamada, another veteran. I've never seen anything like it. The tracers converged from multiple turrets simultaneously. It's like they had a computer calculating where we'd be. They did have computers, Saito thinks but doesn't say. He's read the intelligence reports. General Electric analog fire control systems, remote-controlled turrets, central firing stations where gunners sit in pressurized comfort and kill you from 500 meters away. Did anyone damage one? Saito asks. Silence around the table. Finally, Kashiide speaks. I might have. I saw hits on the wing of one, but it didn't slow down. Didn't break formation, just kept flying like I'd hit it with pebbles. That evening, in the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito receives a briefing from Prime Minister Kuniaki Koiso. The Emperor is 43 years old, trained in marine biology, more comfortable discussing sea creatures than military strategy. But he understands what 100 American bombers over Tokyo means. Will they return? He asks. Yes, Your Majesty, Koiso says. Intelligence estimates they will conduct regular raids now that the Marianas bases are operational. And our defenses? Koiso glances at Arasue, who's been invited to the briefing. The intelligence chief chooses his words carefully. Your Majesty, our fighter aircraft cannot reach the altitude at which the B-29s operate. Our anti-aircraft guns are similarly challenged. We are working on solutions. The Emperor nods slowly. He's heard the real answer in what wasn't said. They have no solution, not one that works. In the weeks that follow, the Japanese military scrambles to adapt. They transfer more fighters to the home islands, ultimately 260 dedicated aircraft with 500 more available for emergencies. They add anti-aircraft batteries around Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya. They expand radar coverage, though the Americans' electronic warfare capabilities will soon render much of that useless. But the core problem remains unsolvable. The B-29 operates in a flight regime the Japanese cannot reach. At 30,000 feet, pressurized, crews comfortable in their heated cabins while Japanese pilots gasp for air at 28,000 feet in unpressurized cockpits. On December 3rd, 9 days after the first raid, the B-29s return. Then again on December 27th, then January 9th. The intervals grow shorter. By February, they're coming every few days. The damage remains limited because the Americans are still trying high-altitude precision bombing. But each raid teaches them something. Each raid brings them closer to the realization that precision doesn't matter when the target is the entire city. Jenda sees it coming. In February, he writes a memo to the General Staff. The Americans will eventually abandon precision bombing and adopt area incendiary attacks. Our cities are particularly vulnerable to fire. We should begin civil defense preparations immediately. The memo is acknowledged and filed. Nothing changes. Japan has too many other crises, too many other fronts collapsing. There's no time, no resources, no ability to evacuate cities or fireproof millions of wooden buildings. By late February, fighter pilots have learned to intercept the B-29s more effectively. Not by climbing to their altitude, that remains impossible, but by attacking during the bombing run when the bombers slow slightly and lose a bit of altitude. It's dangerous work. For every B-29 damaged, 2 or 3 fighters are destroyed. Lieutenant Tanamizu, the young pilot who flew on Kashiide's wing that first day, dies on February 19th over Tokyo. His Ki-84 took hits from a B-29's tail gunner, caught fire, and corkscrewed into Yokohama Harbor. He was 22 years old, had been married for 3 months. His wife, Akiko, would receive a letter telling her he died honorably defending the homeland. The letter wouldn't mention that he was burned alive at 25,000 feet, that his last radio transmission was screaming. The B-29 Superfortress campaign against Japan reveals something fundamental about industrial warfare in the 20th century. Technology creates gaps that tactics cannot bridge. Japan's strategic dilemma in late 1944 wasn't just that the B-29 could carry more bombs, though it could carry the equivalent of 10 Ki-21s. The real problem was systemic. The Superfortress represented the culmination of American industrial capability applied to a single weapon system, pressurization technology from high-altitude research, analog computing for fire control, advanced metallurgy for lightweight but strong airframes, and engines producing horsepower that Japanese engineers had barely conceived. Each B-29 required 13 tons of aluminum, half a ton of copper, 600,000 rivets, 9.5 miles of wiring, and 2 miles of tubing. That's before counting the crew training, the spare parts, the support infrastructure. The Americans built 3,170 of them. The cost exceeded $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project that created the atomic bomb. Japan couldn't match that production even if they'd started in 1939. Their most advanced bomber, the G-8N Renzan, achieved a fraction of the B-29's capability, and they built exactly 4 before the war ended. The industrial gap was unbridgeable. But the truly devastating aspect wasn't the initial raids. It was what came after, when General Curtis LeMay took command in January 1945 and made a decision that changed everything: abandon high-altitude precision bombing and go low with incendiaries. On the night of March 9th 10, 1945, 334 B-29s attacked Tokyo from 5,000 to 9,200 feet, altitudes where Japanese fighters could reach them, but they stripped out the defensive guns to carry more bombs. Each aircraft carried incendiaries, M69 clusters filled with napalm, gelatinized gasoline that ignited on impact and couldn't be extinguished. That single raid killed 100,000 people. It destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo. It created a firestorm that the B-29 crews could see from 150 miles away. In the following months, 63 Japanese cities were burned partially or completely. By August 1945, 500,000 civilians were dead from fire raids alone. 8 million were homeless. Minoru Jenda survived the war. He'd been right about the area incendiary attacks, right that they were unstoppable. After surrender, he met with American officers during the occupation. They showed him the production figures, the bomb tonnage data, the strategic analyses. "Could you have defended against it?" one American asked. Genda thought about all the pilots who'd died trying. He thought about Kashiide, who survived the war but never flew again, his nerves shattered by too many encounters with bombers he couldn't touch. He thought about young Tanamizu, burned alive at 22. "No," Genda said, "not from the moment you secured the Marianas. Perhaps not even if we'd known in 1941 what was coming. You built an aircraft that operated in a realm we couldn't reach, carrying bomb loads we couldn't match, in numbers we couldn't counter. The war was decided by industrial capacity as much as by military action." The B-29 didn't win the war alone. The submarines strangling Japan's shipping, the island-hopping campaign, the atomic bombs, all contributed. But the Superfortress campaign demonstrated that air power could indeed force a nation to surrender without invasion, though the cost in civilian lives remains morally complex decades later. What endures is the lesson about technological overmatch. When one side achieves a capability the other cannot counter, when 10 enemy bombers can be replaced by a single aircraft of such superiority that existing defenses become irrelevant, the outcome is predetermined. The only question is how long the technologically inferior side will continue fighting before acknowledging what their generals already know. Isamu Kashiide, the fighter pilot who couldn't reach the B-29s on that first mission, lived until 2003. In his 70s, he gave an interview to a Japanese television station doing a documentary on the air war. "What was it like that first time you saw them?" the interviewer asked. Kashiide paused, remembering the contrails at 30,000 feet, the silver aircraft gleaming in the morning sun, untouchable. Remembering the ammunition counter clicking to 0, the fuel gauge reading empty, the flight home in a damaged fighter trailing smoke. "It was like watching the future arrive," he said finally. "We were fighting with what we had, what we knew. They were fighting with what we couldn't imagine. The moment I saw those formations, I knew. We were going to lose. It was just a matter of time." The interviewer pressed, "But you kept fighting." "Yes," Kashiide said, "because that's what you do. You keep fighting even when you know. Because those are your cities burning, your people dying. Because surrender means accepting that everything you believed about Japanese military superiority was wrong. So you climb into your fighter one more time, even though you know the Americans are up there at 30,000 feet, carrying bomb loads that beggar imagination, and you can't touch them." He died 3 years later, at 85, in a hospital in Yokohama. The last words in his medical chart, recorded by a nurse: "He kept asking about altitude, kept saying he needed to climb higher. Some gaps you never bridge, some losses you never accept." Even 60 years later, even when the war is long over and the B-29s are museum pieces, you're still in that cockpit, still climbing, still fighting an enemy you can see but cannot reach. That's the real legacy of the B-29 campaign, not just the cities destroyed or the lives lost, but the demonstration that some technological advantages are insurmountable, that industrial capacity matters as much as courage, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is futile. The Japanese generals who couldn't believe one B-29 could carry the bomb load of 10 heavy bombers learned the truth in fire and blood. And in learning it, they learned something harder: that their disbelief changed nothing, that reality doesn't care what you can imagine, and that wars are won not by the warriors who refuse to surrender, but by the nations who can build weapons the enemy cannot counter. On September 2, 1945, as B-29s flew over Tokyo Bay during the surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri, Genda stood on the deck of a Japanese destroyer in the harbor. He watched the bombers pass overhead, their contrails clean white lines against the blue sky, and understood that he was watching the past defeat the future. Japan's military tradition, its warrior ethos, its samurai spirit, all had been crushed by industrial assembly lines in Wichita and Renton, by engineers and factory workers who never fired a shot but built the weapons that made resistance meaningless. The B-29 didn't just defeat Japan. It demonstrated that the age of romantic militarism was over, replaced by an era where wars would be won by whoever could build the most technologically advanced weapons in the greatest numbers. The bomber boys who flew those missions, the fighter pilots who died trying to stop them, they were all actors in a tragedy where the ending was written by production quotas and engineering specifications long before the first shot was fired. That's what the Japanese generals couldn't believe until they saw it with their own eyes, that one aircraft could indeed carry what 10 of theirs could carry, and that this wasn't just a difference in capability. It was a difference in philosophy, in industrial capacity, in the fundamental approach to warfare. It was the future, arriving at 30,000 feet, untouchable and inevitable.